My name is Matt Harriman. This is the Achieve and Enjoy podcast. And today I've got a guest who is, one of the most impactful mentors. I don't know if he knows that or not, but one of my most impactful mentors from my career and my perspective on life and a whole bunch of other stuff that we'll get into. But Jim DuBois, welcome. Thanks for coming on
Thank
to
you.
this conversation with me.
Sure. Thanks for the compliment already.
Yeah, might as well start there. So a little bit background. So Jim, you worked in strategy and portfolio in oil and gas industry for 20
25
something
years
years now.
after
Yeah.
20 years of being a engineer of various descriptions and various, sometimes management, sometimes not, sometimes the hedge manager and various things. But yeah, after that, the strategy portfolio world for about 25 years. Yeah, just retired.
So for people that don't know what strategy or portfolio actually mean, like what is that work?
So, strategy can mean a great deal of things. And in our world, we usually were limited to getting companies to tell us what they wanted to achieve in a more or less numeric way. So, in X number of years, I want to have this much cash flow, this much oil and gas, this much production. I want to have spent this much money and made this much profit. And I have these sorts of projects that I think I can do in that time period. And so our software job was to do an optimization and to find different options that they can consider. And we talk about this a little later. That many people take that way too literally. What we really were doing them was giving them thinking tools about, if this was the world, this would be the best decision to make. Ultimately, a human being has to make the decision. And the consulting part largely had to do with getting people to tell us what they knew on some level, but never said out loud.
Mm.
And then just make sure that they had internal agreement on those kind of things. So what is this company really about? What do we really want to achieve?
And who were some of, not necessarily names of companies, but who were some of the companies, what type of companies did you work with? What scale of decisions were being made, stuff like that?
Sure. So we worked through everything from the largest of the super majors to larger IOCs, international oil companies, the NOC, which is national oil companies. Probably our bread and butter was mid-sized companies in North America,
Mm.
eventually spreading out to the world. And we even helped some startups sort of put together a pitch deck for, this is what I want to achieve and here's how I'm going to achieve it. So it was
Mm.
everywhere from a company that didn't really even exist to companies that are unbelievably huge. And the portfolios themselves had billions and billions and billions of dollars in them. There's always a debate as to what our contribution was. You could create an artificial straw man and say, well, if you had made this decision, you said that decision, you would have saved $20 billion. No one ever paid us $20 billion to make that decision. It's debatable. What we were doing was providing thinking tools and structure to sometimes very large decisions.
Yeah, and I mean, the decision-making process and what should be done is not that different when you're dealing with, 200 bucks or 200 billion, just the amount of energy that you put into it, right?
Well, the guy with $200, the last $200 is probably putting more energy into it. So,
Yeah, fair. Yeah,
so
good point.
but yeah, we found that the correlation, I said, the smaller the company, the more complex the portfolio, because every single thing was important to them.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes those were so complex as to be unmanageable, where a super major might have said, yeah, that's maybe worth $300 billion, but just work with it.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't necessarily scale. Complexity and difficulty doesn't necessarily scale with size. You're right.
So, I think one of the obviously the impact and importance of the work that you've done, I think is interesting. The other interesting part, and one of the main reasons that I wanted you to be effectively the first guest on this show, is that you always, at least on the surface, seemed like one of the happier people that I worked with. That, being able to do a lot of interesting things, have big impact at work, but you didn't seem all that stressed out. You didn't seem to be working nights and weekends and all of that kind of stuff. And that could have been the point in your career that we overlapped, and who knows.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that some more, but I want to start with probably your most infamous quote. So I asked this morning some people in our group what you and I should talk about, and they gave me the same quote that I had was when you said, and I'll tell you the first time that I heard it, or that I remember hearing it, is you and I were in a meeting. It was a frustrating meeting where management wanted to do something. You and I didn't think that that was a good idea. I think I knew that you didn't think that that was a good idea, whatever the thing was, but you didn't really like say anything in the meeting. You just kind of like let it go. And then afterward, I asked, "Hey, like, why didn't you say anything, or why didn't you confront that, or like what was going on?" And you just said, "I don't have fuck you money, but I have I'd really rather not money." And so I took that to mean I'm not gonna get in their face, but I'm also not gonna do the thing that they wanted to do that I know is stupid. Is kinda
So
how I took that. So I wanna hear more about, what's the difference
yeah,
between "fuck you money" and "really rather not money," and yeah. Tell me more
so
about
on
that.
on an extremely practical level, because we had sold the previous company to the company that we worked for, and because my parents, my wife's parents were good managers of their money, I really had enough that I could have retired, in my late 50s if I really wanted to. I wouldn't have had exactly the lifestyle I wanted, but I would have had a reasonable one. But the point of the story is that that made me even more aware than before that I had agency,
Mm,
that it was me, a person with choices, choosing to be in that meeting and choosing to do what I thought was right or wrong. Now, generally in business, I would not do what I thought was morally wrong, but I would execute a decision I didn't agree with. That's just part of the whole thing. If I wanted to have sacrificed, we talk about this later too, sacrifice my life to be higher in the, what I consider my life, to be higher in the decision stream, maybe I would have gotten there. Maybe I would have been the one making the decision that you didn't like. But the ultimate thing is that I felt like I had agency to do or not do whatever I considered right or wrong.
mm,
And bigger story there is that almost everybody, I can picture somebody working their second job to make sure their children gets enough medicine. But most people do have more agency than they think they do. And they shouldn't ever consider themselves to be a cog in the wheel. You're a person, you have choices. And I also always had a rule that if I didn't agree with something, I would bring it up one time and I'd make absolutely sure that whatever I was saying was understood. And once it was understood, and if it wasn't immoral or illegal, then I was willing to follow along. But I didn't feel it was my job to stay completely silent with stuff where I had better information or a different point of view. I also never thought it was my job to just become some screaming, maniac over something that wasn't life or death.
and I'm pretty sure that example in that meeting that we were in, you had already voiced, at other times that you thought whatever was gonna happen was a bad idea, or that you disagreed with it, or whatever, and so, yeah, I think that's a level of maturity that is hard to get to for a lot of people. That, okay, they understand my opinion, they disagree with it, but they have the decision authority. So that's part of the agreement, is if I work for you, you get to make those decisions and all that kind of stuff. Why do you think people don't have, or don't think that they have as much agency as they actually do?
So it boils down probably to a combination of fear and to just, the old story about in the circus, you start out with a baby elephant chained to the ground. And as the elephant grew, it eventually got so strong it could pull the chain, obviously. You just had to hang a chain from the elephant's neck and they would stay where they were because they were just used to that was what happened. I think most people, and I'm sure you and me too, and just we tell about our more shining moments, but we get used to, okay, this was something, this is the way this is supposed to work, this is the way it's always worked. And I will continue to work that way because that's the path of least resistance. And that's fine as long as it's not immoral or illegal, unless it is making you unhappy.
Yeah.
And at that point, you are sacrificing. Well, earlier, I said, give up my life. I didn't mean give up my life literally, to give up the life I wanted to do something. At that point, you are giving up the life that you want to not cause some temporary stress. Now, I'm extremely confrontational averse. And so, what I learned to do is to get anything that might be a disagreement or anything else might be uncomfortable out as early as possible in a relationship. I hate you, but if you're working with a client and I see a problem that this part of the software, this part of the process might not work, I drive sales or drove salespeople crazy because I would tell them the client that when I met them and say, okay, here's the problems that we might be having down the road. And they said, no, just let them slide.
Yeah.
No, I'm not constituted to hold that secret in the back of my mind for the next 6 months, hoping that something doesn't go wrong. We need to be partners in this. The client and I need to be partners in this. We need to understand.
That's awesome. No, I'm taking some notes here. So if you see me looking down, I'm not tweeting. I was talking to Leslie yesterday about, a situation that we've got at a client. There's crap going on as happens on projects and with clients and stuff. And we were kind of thinking through it and processing it. There's a lot of emotions tied to this thing for various reasons. But what we're dealing with right now is basically exactly that, is that we kind of decided intentionally a few months ago. I think we were doing an okay job of this before, but now we kind of decided that, we're gonna bring problems to a head as fast as we can and not let that things fester and just kind of go on and drag on. Cause that was the thing that felt really soul sucking to both of us in, the corporate environment, is when, something kind of sucks, but it's not like that bad, but nobody really disagrees with it. It's just this extremely mediocre, work product or idea or whatever it is. And everybody just kind of goes along with it because it's easier to produce a shit thing than it is to tell 10 people to, hey, we need to stop this and this isn't working. Yeah. And so we're dealing with some of that now, but how did you realize that bringing up a problem or an issue earlier, like, lessened the controversy or the confrontational, like, aspect of it?
This may not be true, but what comes at me, the facts are true. It may not be the one moment that I realized that, but when I first got a management position, I was in my later 20s, but I was pretty young and took over a department of 10 people. And there was somebody else in that department who felt that they should have had the job. And looking back, he had a pretty good argument. So he kind of became a bit of obstructionist. And I just spent, this was, still 20 something year old kid. And so big responsibility. And, some ways, hey, my dreams came true. I got this job. And I just spent like a month with a stomach ache all the time. Just, not even wanting to meet him in the eye. And he's worked for me at this point. And it's just like absolutely miserable. And it's one of the earliest things I can think of is saying, why did we ever get here? Why didn't we just sit down on day one and say, hey, I didn't give myself this job. Somebody gave me this job. Can you work here or not? Well, we give you 100% here. Good at what you do. Looking back, I said, why did I put myself through that? Why
Yeah.
didn't I just go ahead and get it out? And then later on in life, when I stopped working in the operating end and started working in consulting, it just became obvious that every time I got anxious is because I was hoping somebody didn't find out some deep secret that we didn't disclose fully at some point, or even, not really a secret, but a doubt that maybe they weren't understanding. The communication hadn't taken place. We told them what we could do. They heard what they wanted to hear. We let them hear what they wanted to hear. So they were on
Mhm.
the bottom line. No one ever did this. At least we were a small company. We never did this on purpose, but it happened. Later on, I can't say what the salespeople, but, uh, and then I started, I never ever told anybody anything that's going to be a problem coming up. Hey, if this happens, then it's not going to work the way you think it's going to work. I've never heard anybody get outraged at that,
Mhm.
quit because of that, or say, okay, then we're done because of that. It was just, okay, that really disappoints me, but
Yeah.
we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And as long as we maintained a partnership with the other party in this thing, it's okay, here's where we have to navigate around. The only times that ever really became more of a problem, this happens more than people would think, when all of a sudden new management comes in and here's how we're going to do this. And no, we can't do it that way.
Yeah.
Thank God we did. But other than that, anybody that you build a relationship with, which is anybody you work with in the consulting world, I think they can handle that as long as you don't make them look bad in their world, right? As long as they've had all the tools to deal with that from the beginning.
I saw a couple of weeks ago, Adam Grant said something. I can't remember all of it, but he said something about communication being direct and kind. And that's really what you can fall back on. And it's hard to go wrong if you're actually coming from, a reasonable, kind place. No matter what the news is, if you have the best intent, then you should be okay. I've found with consulting, the buyers and the people, that I'm working with directly, they really appreciate that. because especially in a lot of big organizations, people don't tell the truth. Like, there's a lot of happy talk and there's washing over things or everything is good and everything. And then, you get to the end of the year and whatever the numbers are 80% of what they should have been. And everybody knew it except for the person who's going to get fired for it. And that stuff is scary. And so I found that in companies, the people that I'm working with directly appreciate it, but the others involved and around it are very uncomfortable because they're used to saying that everything is good and we're happy and all that stuff. One piece that you mentioned on, why don't people have the agency or think that they have the agency that they do is fear. And I think a good time for another story about whenever I was thinking about starting Pod 2, I didn't even know what it was at the time. It was kind of right before I was going to take a sabbatical and I was talking to you about what do I do? I could go take a job. I don't know how this is going to work out. I was definitely wrestling with, some resistance and some fear of the unknown. And I think you told me something that pushed me over the edge. That was, you said you're young, you're educated, you're motivated, and you're white in America. I said yes, and you said you'll be fine. Like, just given the circumstances, given everything, like whatever you do, you can go try something, and if it doesn't work out, try something else. You can save up, get a job again. You're not going to go unemployed. You're not going to go homeless if your startup doesn't work out. And I don't know, that was just a level of perspective that I really, really needed to hear at the time. Like, that was the final thing. I had kind of gotten over some of the imposter syndrome, scary, like, entrepreneurs or superheroes misconceptions and gotten over some of the other stuff and things like that. But that was one of the last chips to fall that helped me make the jump. And all of that is just rooted in fear. So I want to ask, like, how did you, I don't know, get that perspective? How do you think about that? How do you I know it's easier to think about risks and somebody's situation from the outside looking in, but I wanted to know if you learned that lesson a hard way also.
So you may not remember the rest of that conversation when I told you that was, in my opinion, the best advice for you. It wouldn't be the best advice for me,
Mm,
which comes back to, my always something I think is important. I would try to do is no one size fits all answers for people, but you should really consider the thing. For you, it was obvious to me that you were not going to be happy until you stepped out and tried this thing. Therefore, you were putting your best life in jeopardy. You were taking a risk by not doing this of being miserable for the next 30 years, which was then going to seep into your family life and your personal life and everything else. And on the practical level, that list, you and I both are quite privileged people. I mean, for better or for worse, it's difficult when I'm not young anymore, when you're young and you have all those advantages, it's difficult for you to end up homeless unless you become mentally ill or embittered or something like that. But as long as you keep the perspective that I took this risk, I've never seen it turn out badly for anybody. Now, that would not have been my best life. I did not have a drive to go out on my own. I worked for a very small company for a long time and enjoyed that. But I got to make believe somebody else was taking care of me. And he was, but he didn't have he had the full agency to do that either. He could only do what he could do. But
yeah.
it all worked out. In my life, I was always pretty good at taking whatever official job I had and turning into the job that I wanted. And after my very first job, entry level, I had a college job, which we were just like being trained. After that job, every other job, people were more than willing to let me do that. So I was usually, I was never super frustrated because I would find a way to do what I wanted to do. But that was me. That was not you.
Yeah.
So to you, I took a look and said, where's the risk here? Actually, we were eating lunch, right? So I said back somewhere in the back of my mind, where's the risk here?
Yeah.
Is there a bigger risk that he's going to start his family, or is there a bigger risk that he's going to be a miserable person? And all the other things were true. You and I are privileged, and we are the least likely people because of a lot of things that aren't our fault or our benefit or our credit either. That it's pretty hard for us to end up on the trash heap.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that conversation, and I think that's a really strong, I don't know, that's an important thing to realize, and especially as the advice giving, market is probably bigger than it's ever been, especially on the internet, especially with all the dudes selling PDFs. about how to sell people PDFs. That advice, all of it has to it depends on the context, it depends on the situation, the same advice and the same lessons, that I've found apply for me sometimes, but not others, and timing and all that stuff matters a lot.
And then we'll hopefully get into this even more with some later questions, but you can't really separate success in a business world. I don't think you can. I think it's hard. Success in a business world with success at life itself. It would benefit you, I think, or anyone to take the whole picture into account when you're defining success and when you're striving it. One of those things in the success industry that drives me crazy is the whole find a very specific goal and concentrate on that goal. And I'm going to be the president of, you know, General Electric. So, that's my perfect job, I guess. But it's going to be something really big deal, which is a lot of people look for that job too. A and number and B, you have got yourself so narrow and you put this thing out that is now your goal, but you haven't said why. They're asking me deep questions of where do I want to be? The proverbial on my deathbed, look back, was like, well, by God, thank God I was the president of GE. That's not what it is. Another thing, the whole thing about parents who drive their children to the point, I mean, I'm all about high expectations for your kids, drive their children to the point of not having a child, go practice for hours and then do all your homework and then clean up the dishes and go to bed and repeat. So they will be successful. What's the end game? What happens then? And they become doctors and lawyers and drive their own kids crazy. And again, I'm not about, I was never a permissive parent or anything, but I think at some point you've got to know you got to think a little more deeply than success.
I've got an answer on this, but what questions do you ask yourself or would you ask yourself or advise somebody to ask themselves to dig a little deeper into what's the why behind whatever the goal is you think you have or defining what success looks like?
Yeah, I think you can play you're much closer to having a kid than I am. It's the second 2 or 3 year old, whatever the game is of, just everything, say something, say why. So
Yeah.
I want to start a business. Why? Because I'm tired of my boss or because I want to make a difference in something that I don't see anybody making a difference in and so forth. And then why? And then you get to the point that you say, and I want to have a life work balance. Well, life work balance doesn't mean anything to me. Well, why do you want to have life work balance? What does that mean? Does that mean that you define a relationship with your wife and kids and with outside interests, or it's the kind of person you want to be that's achieved these things? And if you achieve all those things, which includes something in your work life, something in your some sort of a spiritual life, whatever that might be, and something in your home life, and that's the package, and you get enough whys backwards. I think that the question really is why.
Yeah.
You tell me what you want to do and then tell me why. And don't stop at something superficial or something
Yeah.
that puts you in competition with millions of other people that want the same one job. I mean, you're going to drive yourself crazy. You're one person to get that job, and then they're going to do an interview saying, all I had to do is believe myself. So you got to define what it is eventually that you really want to be driving your life. And it's not a position, usually not an income level.
Couple of different directions we could go with this. Like one is I think a lot of people have a hard time coming up with an answer to, what do you want? Or like I know some people have, I want to be this level person at this company. Some people have that, but I think there's a lot of people that really just have no idea what they want. And I think there's two things. One is whatever comes to mind, like write it down and then test it and improve it over time. These kind of questions and what you want out of life, I feel like they change over time. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, they do, either because they simply change or because you learn and mature, probably a combination of the two. You find out that one thing you thought was really great, either it wasn't that great or that wasn't fulfilling when you got there, or you got close enough to realize the people that got there were sacrificing something that you wanted. And there's a red flag of what were they sacrificing? Why were you uncomfortable
Yeah.
about taking that next step?
I mean, that was definitely my experiences because for a long time it was just all I wanted was more impact, more promotions, more all of that kind of stuff. And then I found that every time I got another promotion or a raise or whatever, it wasn't satisfying. So it was pretty quickly apparent that it was a ladder that just had no end to it. But then after I started the business in October of 19, I knew what I didn't want to do, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do at that point. So, the business was anti what I was doing before. And then when COVID hit 5 months later, I found a couple of questions that helped me really get clarity into that end point. And it was the combination of the two that I really liked. The first one was, if you had 6 weeks left to live, what would you do? So that kind of helped me figure out, okay, what would I regret out on my deathbed? Kind of get to that answer. And then the other one was, what would I do if I had all the time and money in the world? And so that one kind of uncovers aspirations, and if it wasn't money, if it wasn't time, like what would you want to spend your free time doing? And for some people that could be art, all kinds of different things. But like those two questions together, and I've talked to a few people about this and helped them figure shit out. And those two questions together seem to trigger a lot of useful kinds of thoughts and answers and stuff.
That's not great. Neither by itself, because of the 6 weeks, you'd cut out anything that had to do with getting better at anything, right? You just enjoy it. And you can only do that. That's one of what they warn you about in retirement, by the way, is the first year is the vacation year. Do whatever you want to do. And then you realize, hey, this actually is getting pretty boring. I've got to actually go out and achieve something that exactly to my taste now. No one else can tell me anymore. I'm going to do something that I want to do. But after about a year, most people find some kind of, or that they just sit and watch TV. Most successfully retired people find something at some point that they want to do that's continue to grow and improve. But it certainly is a question that gets back to what's important to you.
Yeah.
And very seldom is it going to be have much to do with work. Although some people's work is so satisfying and so fulfilling to them, it would be, I just can keep on doing what I'm doing. The people who never retire for a number of reasons, some because they just can't stop, and some because they're workaholics, and some because they need the money, and some because they just enjoy the hell out of it.
And that's at least what we're trying to build a company and our own work in such a way that we wouldn't want to retire. And obviously everything changes all the time, so who knows how far that'll go, but I feel like that's a pretty good guiding light for us to make a company that we like the work that we do, we like the people that we work with, and it's sustainable for us. Because I heard about somebody was saying that most startups don't fail, or a lot of startups fail because of money. Obviously, their business sucks, and so they run out of juice. But the other big reason is because the founders actually hate the work that they're doing, and so they just run out of gas. They don't want to do it anymore. So financial success, kind of either way, they don't want to do it. I remember John Howell, and maybe I'll do one of these with him and introduce him to people. But he said about you that I want to say that he said that you've never worked more than 45 hours in a week in your life. I don't think that was totally true, but I think he meant it as a compliment, saying
Yeah.
that you could keep healthy boundaries around your work and stuff like that.
Love John to death. One of the favorite dogs I ever read. But yeah, I had worked over 25 hours in a week, and he would say he worked 80 hours. I don't think that's possible, but he did work a lot of 60-hour weeks.
I know how it's possible. I saw his timesheets. So when he was on a international flight, the flight time was 10 hours, and then he would work for those 10 hours. So boom, that's 20 hours. Right.
No. But anyway, no. John is one of my all-time mentors, and
Yeah.
so he would have a completely different perspective on this because he throws himself into everything. So he, as a young man, was a world-class sailor, and he always said he had to stop sailing because he couldn't work and sail at the same time, because both of them, he started again when he retired, but both of them to him were all in. Managed to, have a nice home life and be happy too. So his would be an interesting perspective to add to my complete type B personality, his complete type A personality. And he has some interesting stories that I won't quote here. I'll leave them for him, but some great stories about realizations that he had at certain points in his career that he was going down the wrong path, and people pointing it out to him, brave enough and kind enough to point out to him that this is not the way for you or for anybody around you. He took those to heart and stuff.
Interesting. I need to talk to him. So on the call about whether it's 45 hours a week or not, and I'm pretty sure that that week, especially, like you were actually working like quite a bit because of some project or something, the week that he said that. But how did you think about the time spent working versus not? And I know work-life balance has a lot of baggage to that topic, but how did you think about it? How did you think about like, the time that you spent working specifically?
So I have two answers. The first is that the example that I got from my father, who was successful, particularly since he came from a blue collar background and went to college only because of the GI Bill after World War II. And ended up, he was in charge of all construction projects for a cement company, which is a pretty big deal. But he also, except for 1 year when he was a consultant between jobs, I don't remember him ever not being home by 5:30. He worked in downtown Dallas. We worked back then. You could get from downtown Dallas to suburban Dallas in half an hour. I don't remember him ever not being home by 5:30. I'm sure occasionally he was. He did travel sometimes. He was out of town and worked pretty hard when he was traveling. But for the most part, he was home at night for dinner. I don't remember him ever tying himself down with work on the weekend or anything like that. So my mental image of what it was to be a successful person and someone that lived to be 90, comfortable retirement, pass money on to his heirs and everything else. So yes, he did very well. But that mental image was never this person spending all their life at the office and having ulcers and everything else. It was somebody that was balanced. That just to me was how it was supposed to be. I think a lot of people that grew up in the I grew up in the 60s, they get probably 60s and 70s, got that example, didn't get it now. Um,
Mm.
I don't think he could have held the position he did, even though he got it and held it from pure competence. But I think there's a political end to corporations these days that just have to be seen in the calls afterwards. It's a very, I don't know, it's a very American thing. It's more of an American thing than anything else. Even in Canada, people don't quite buy into that whole myth. Well, I always thought that was the mental model. It never occurred to me to try to kill myself to become VP or something. And the second story is completely different, but it's that when I was managing an apartment of 10 people in my late 20s, I was lightly on the corporate upswing and a bit of a favored person. I got rare kind of leukemia to the point that I had to be, spent like essentially a quarter either in the hospital or at home getting ready to go to the hospital. And it was a pretty stressful time. When I went back, the unit had that worse where it was sold before that happened, just before that happened. I'm like, I bet there's no management job left for me. We got put back in the ranks. So the two lessons there. One is the lesson everybody gets when they have a critical disease. So it's back to your 6 weeks question. I was 32 or 3 and still thought I was immortal. So I never really sat there and said, am I going to die? But you do kind of say, okay, well, what was important? But the other maybe more interesting thing is that having been kind of on the corporate ladder and all of a sudden being stuck right back, you all of a sudden sit there and say, well, that was interesting. Now that I'm not all of a sudden not doing that anymore, what was I doing right? What was I doing wrong? And would I want to do that again? If I did, how would I handle it differently?
Yeah.
And so that ended up also saying, okay, well, I'm not going to ever be at the office just to be at the office. There's something that has to be done. I'm more than willing to do something that has to be done. If something has to be done to the tune of 60 hours a week every week, then someone has misdesigned something. So someone didn't either delegate it out so we all share that or something. But anyway, it ended up saying, okay, I was unusually thoughtful at a weird place where most people who are kind of identified and start becoming mentors and so forth don't ever get that chance of reflection.
Mm.
Keep moving slowly or quickly up that ladder. You never have a chance to think back and stop. And so I did. And so I always thought that life had to do with your wife and your kids and your life and enjoying and so forth. And I never saw that as a conflict with becoming highly competent at something.
Yeah.
And I was just to think about it and agreed with myself.
I think a lot of people experienced some portion of that where I think there's a lot of stories about where people faced, the possibility of death and that brought them some clarity and changed things for the better for them. And I think the whole world got some version of that in 2020.
Mhm.
And it just brought, the possibility that you could die into people's awareness a little bit more. I know I had, and it's interesting you say, I want to be able to be, successful in your career, but also, not sacrifice being a good dad and taking care of, your family and things like that, because that was a huge turning point for me when we had our first daughter. I think I was 27, 26 at the time. And, she was born with medical condition in the NICU, very, very scary. And since then, lots of near misses with death. And so that brought it very, very much into my awareness. And I don't know about you, but I went through times where like that definitely did bring me a lot of perspective on, hey, this work stuff that I was really stressed out about, I don't need to stress about it. But I did find that sometimes it took me too far the other way. It was like, okay, none of this shit matters. I don't need to try out anything and all that. And then obviously that has its own ramifications on your life and quality of life and stuff like that. Did you ever swing too far the other way?
Probably not too much. I always had, again, going back to my father, who I did admire quite a bit, had been in World War II, pretty heavy stuff. And somehow he never talked about that until he was 80. But somehow I got this philosophy that, no soldiers left on the field. So whatever else I thought I would never, and this is part of being a consultant as well, I would never leave anybody else in the lurch if I possibly could do anything about it. Even if I said, well, I don't really, I just soon go home and I don't really care if this project's not that important to me. But if somebody else was going to catch flack for it and I could help them through a bottleneck, that's something that I just found myself compelled to do. As uncompelled I was to put in an extra hour to get an extra dollar, I was compelled to put an extra hour to not leave somebody else in a bad place. So I think that kind of saved me from ever being a complete zero to me.
And that was the thing that brought me back was, when I was in more of an individual contributor role, that's when the risk of, okay, this shit doesn't matter. Like it was hard to motivate myself to do things, but as I was, managing other people, like the people that were on my team were the ones that they were the reason that I put forth effort. And I think that was a good way, and that is a good way to go about things, is taking care of the people. Because I've told people on your deathbed, you're not going to remember, whether you made the Q2 2019 target or not, but you'll remember, if you mistreated somebody or if you could have done more for somebody, like those sorts of things are what you'll remember. So yeah, I think we landed on similar things. Yeah, even, in that place where I had a job, I think what I'm doing now and in pod 2, I'm a lot more passionate and there's a lot more meaning in the work for me than there was before. What else did you learn and take from your dad?
As far as business things, that's probably the two biggest thing is that. And I never was aware of him ever like angling for a job or anything. I do know he was very conscientious about being good at what he did. A job well done was very important to him. I know he enjoyed being able to support the family in a nice way, but it seemed obviously to make the job well done was much more important than a brass ring grab.
I see it being really tough for people in companies because there are so many people playing the politics and the self-marketing and self-promotion and all of that stuff. And I don't think that managers and leaders are aware enough about that going on. I think they probably know it, but they still succumb to it and promote people that talk nicely but don't do as good a job. I know that was something that I really, really tried to do because I was frontline manager, and if I knew that somebody was really good at their job, but they weren't the type to toot their own horn, then I would go try to toot it for them. That sounded awful. But but I think there is something, and I've been thinking about this with the business also. It is not enough to just do good work. There's an aspect of you do kind of have to tell people about it.
Depends the organization. Hopefully, the organization can automatically tell. But if you get five people doing the same job, it's not clear who did what. Then yeah, that has to be. That's the manager's job. I think that's what you're inferring. Really, the manager's job to clarify for other people who the really great people are as far as getting the job done. There's another aspect. I had several people at various times responsible for, in a work sense, obviously, that were wonderful people that tried very hard, but they were completely in the wrong role and didn't really want to hear that, but ultimately it's some sort of a kindness to get them, because both of the ones I'm thinking about would have been, I think one of them eventually became what he should have been, which is someone who's essentially spent all their time dealing with people, and people that had technical roles that just would get lost in details and technical and never could find their way to coming to a solution. But they were wizards. I mean, wizards at human relations, to the point that this one guy, we were walking from the Dallas Museum of Art to our building, which is a block and a half. And, he would make a friend in that time. Somebody was waiting for the same stoplight we were. They did not being my fast friends. I'm going, how did you do that? But he would just get lost and try, he sometimes his office was like a murder scene where he'd have all these things with strings going from one to one and find it. Never could come to a conclusion.
Raul's somebody that reminds me of that person that they've never met somebody that they're not just almost immediately friends with and can form a connection with and bond. And it's really cool to see those people because I'm not one of them for sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk oil and gas a little bit?
Sure.
We mentioned a little bit at the beginning about what your role was. I think I'll kind of summarize it as, helping executives primarily figure out what the company needed to be when it grew up and turning that into some numerical targets that they could start to put actionable plans to, and portfolio optimization in order to achieve those different targets and learning about things. We haven't talked about this in a long time, but what are people doing wrong most often in that space? Like, how are they misusing portfolio models, or how are they misrepresenting their own strategy and what they're wanting and things like that?
Yeah, so I think portfolio models, really any models I imagine come close to this. You create an artificial world that in certain aspects looks like the world you're dealing with.
Mm.
And in doing so, both in doing, creating it and in running it, you make a number of assumptions, probably more than you're aware sometimes, but you make all kinds of assumptions anywhere what the future of the price is going to be, to what the ratio oil and gas price might be, or availability, to what capital is going to be available and at what cost to, and make a ton of assumptions. And given those assumptions, you could run the model out and say, under these conditions, what is the best combination of projects to do and when? And by the way, that's not even real, because in the real world, you get to remake some of your decisions every year, and you get to, but this is like you're looking at the whole future in one big row.
Mm.
And that could be very useful if you have the right mindset for it, which is, I'm running an artificial model with a bunch of artificial assumptions. And in that world, I get this answer. Isn't that interesting? Now I'm going to change a few assumptions. I'm going to run it again. I'm going to see what changed and what doesn't change. And isn't that interesting? This is never forecasting the future for you. It's never giving you the right answer. It is allowing you to learn how the system that you've approximated, your approximation of the system, and hopefully the real system, behaves under certain conditions. You're never going to create those same conditions in the real world. The real world is going to work out differently. You're going to just the process work out differently. It's running these models and then making believe that you just told you the feature and here's the answer. Or someone making believe that and then trying to run that up to their management who's not so willing to just accept that. And everybody's not on the same page of what we've just done. And I'm not saying I think the models are extremely useful, but only if you have in the mindset exactly what you're doing. One of my favorite quotes from myself was always tell people that let's not make believe we know what we can't know. We ran this out with an assumption of the next 40 years of oil and gas prices. Well, we believe we know something we don't know. So don't keep asking to rerun it until you think you came up with the right price. You haven't and you won't. But let's hit a high and a low. Let's see what's like an extraordinarily high, extraordinarily low, and medium prices, and see if there's any commonalities and seeing what's moving in and out. So it's all about learning from a model and not expecting a model to be the answer. And that
Yeah.
requires, and then there's another process, which is the person that's running the model day to day is low enough in the organization that they are learning, but no one's listening to them.
Yeah.
Problem. So, but also, the C-suite can't really be sitting around running these models. That's ridiculous. So you've got to have someone with a lot of clout and a lot of people listen to run around these models. You can have somebody that they believe what's happening. They understand what's happening. They're not trying to constantly boil it down.
I've seen that case in other arenas, even in field development planning, where the person running the model, analyzing scenarios, they understand things very deeply, but they get one slide in 2 minutes in a 1 hour meeting in order to explain what they're thinking, and it just doesn't work. Like, it gets wasted. It seems like the education and what you said about what you're doing with a portfolio model is you're creating an artificial world. That's something I distinctly remember a conversation with a company, and it was a meeting with, some folks with the business and some people in IT. We were talking about integrations and how do we make Intersight link with portfolio and connect it to SAP, and like, how do we make this whole system, like all the data flow through everything? And I was, at the time, I think I was parroting some of what you and John and others would say about what you get out of the portfolio model, and the portfolio analysis is not a budget, you get learnings. And the IT guy at the time, he said, "How the fuck am I supposed to integrate learnings into SAP?" I was like, "Yeah, you don't." And he and I had a good relationship, though. It was funny. Like, it wasn't aggressive. Yeah, and I think that that's such a different way of working. I see a lot of companies take a portfolio model, get the outputs from it, and turn those into, here's the capital allocation, here's the budget for each business unit, and your targets for each business unit. That seems wrong.
Sure. Now, someone might use that as their major tool in making those decisions, but that's a different thing. So,
Yeah.
okay, if I want to have a little bit of pad in case prices go down, maybe they don't. I say, I'm all in on this price drop. I know it's not real, but I'm all in. That's fine. But sometimes we end up talking as if the model was a person, the person was cognizant, the person was making decisions. And people either objected to that 100% or they bought into it. And neither is correct. It's a tool that you should be using to add to your own intelligence.
How do you think about aligning those learnings that you get out of a portfolio analysis and how they inform the strategy? How do you think about aligning that work and the company strategy with the execution on the ground? A little context to that question is the classic issue of the business units. Corporate thinks the business units are sandbagging. So corporate adds 10% of production with no more capital and all of that kind of crap. And the communication and the trust just seems to break down and like it just gets nasty. There's no way that the optimal decisions are being made in that kind of environment. So how should that work? Or how would you advise that somebody that's
Yeah.
trying to figure that out?
So there's a little bit of two separate issues there, but how it should work, what we always classically say, and I don't think we ever changed our mind, was your highest strategy should come with insight that came from a portfolio model.
Mhm.
And then you work backwards into what have we decided to do this year, which is kind of a budgeting thing almost, in order to put ourselves in the best place to enact that strategy. There may have been what's called business planning in the middle, which is kind of like a middle ground, more detailed thing. And you work backwards. And then the interesting thing is sometimes, like for instance, what does a guy on the ground need to know this year? Dollars per barrel might be a very interesting number for him to know this year because that's a goal for him. Dollars per barrel is not a good way to design your portfolio. In a portfolio, I have goals for how much profit I want to make. And that's going to end up automatically creating, when you have decided what you're going to do, $8 per barrel, because you're going to make barrels, you're going to make profit, and it's going to cost you some money. Those are your assumptions. So there are metrics that are used to make people be able to run a short-term plan through a business, which often end up getting kicked up to higher than they deserve because that's not, it's again, it's what do you really want to do? I don't really
Yeah.
want dollars per barrel here. I want to make money. I want to be unethical, blah, blah, blah. But the corporate world, I want to make X money and make sure my investors are getting their return and so forth. And everything else is details. And
Yep.
those things shouldn't be running the model. Unless, for instance, I had a very famous geologist convinced me that production goals, for instance, were as important as cash flow goals because production goals is real, right? Nothing is real, but you have more control over your production goals than you do over your cash flow goals. So you
Yeah.
got to have something you can cut back to. But be as it may, things that we use in the field, we sell it. Okay, your contribution unit X this year is we need this much cash from you, and we can give you this much cash to generate it. Now, I can tell you what went into what the model says, but it doesn't make a difference. As long as you take my X cash and give me back X cash and whatever else I promised the world, maybe I promised them production, maybe I promised them reserve growth. That's what we are just assigning you. But I need to take my hands off and not tell you, happy to tell you how the model got there, but you are not constrained by how the model got there. You're
Yeah.
constrained by getting the model what it really needed. But
Right. Well, and I think that's a piece where by over constraining their business units, I think that they're suppressing creativity and problem solving and optimizations that they could make. And so I like the idea, and obviously it's necessary to have here's your maximum capital, here's your minimum production, whatever your targets are. But then I think some companies I've seen are getting to that next level of within these constraints, optimize for NPV or optimize for profitability or cash flow, or like whatever that the role of that asset in the portfolio is, so that they're guiding the people on, what is a better field development plan. Similar to idea to, how I understand the portfolio is you've got your set of constraints and then you've got the thing that you're trying to maximize as much as you can and guiding the different pieces that way.
yeah, which it boils down to communication. And I've seen this go wrong lots of times. Is yes, the people that made the longer term decisions can really tell the people that are responsible for executing the short term in order to get there, can really communicate with them what the game really is, what we're really trying to achieve, what your role has been in
Mhm.
this, and then you go do your role to the best possible, but don't go up and say, well, no, I didn't make anything you told me to, but look at all this profit I made. Well, that's fine, but that's not what I needed. Somebody else who was better equipped to make that profit than you were, but they needed the cash to do that. And, as long as everybody understands that you're talking about sandbagging, we get that in a second, but there's also sort of a close to the vestedness of need to know. There's a lot more people think there's need to know than there really is. I came out wrong. A lot of people need to know a lot of things and don't get any information you don't need to know. And better worlds are worlds when everybody kind of understands what they're trying to do. As far as sandbagging goes, I've always said if you just let 1 year go by when nobody gets to adjust anybody else's numbers, you put your numbers in, my numbers come out, we'll find out real quickly who's now, statistically, maybe it's been a bad year for you. We can get into statistics if you want to, but the reality is that if I'm constantly adjusting your numbers, then you're not responsible for the numbers anymore.
Yeah. No, I think we should leave the statistics and uncertainty and risk for maybe a round 2. I think we might need fajitas and scotch for that one, like we did last time. What about emissions and transition to net zero, carbon transition, all of that stuff? I want to get your take on it because if you listen to the people that are trying to sell you stuff in that space, it's a whole new world. We need to rethink everything that we're doing. We need to blow up, how we've been operating and then operate in a completely new way. I mean, I've got a hunch that that's not totally true, but I want to get your take on, how
Yeah.
should companies be thinking about emissions, carbon transition, et cetera?
Right. And let's stay within my wheelhouse in the portfolio world because this was just starting to come up more just as I was phasing myself out. And what you're saying was interesting because I would say, well, portfolio wise, it's actually just another constraint you've added to the model, and you have to know what it is that you're trying to maximize. I guess no, no, no. I tried that. It doesn't work. Well, no, you didn't really try it because you thought there was a complicated step in the middle. And there may be all kinds of complicated steps technically, but as far as thinking about planning goes, what you need is what are your carbon goals? How much are you going to drop carbon over what time period? And how are you going to determine the goodness of that so that we can maximize something? In other words, are you going to get carbon emissions to zero or net zero or XYZ because you're a good person? In which case you hats off to you, but you're going to have a hard time with your investors at some point. Or are you going to do it because the government's telling you have to do it, as in Canada might be? Well, then that's easy enough. We've got to do it in order to continue. So we put that goal in there and it's going to probably ding our bottom line. We have to understand how can we get that down, minimizing the ding to the bottom line. Or are you going to do it because you think it's actually going to be required in order to compete in stock market? There's actually a non-NPV related value, or it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get into the NPV that I'm going to be worth more than my competitors because my stock's going to be worth more. Then you're going to have to find some metrics that you think is going to be maximized. That the more you take your carbon down, just other things are going to get better. You have to find that number. So it ends up just being a simple, I mean, and I realize that the future of the world is at stake and everything else, but it ends up in this particular thing just being another constraint problem. I have a new
Yeah.
constraint. I have to then describe the carbon behavior of my investments and of my holdings. I have to describe the cost of reducing those and not describe any benefits that I'm going to acknowledge that's going to happen. Then I have to balance the portfolio like any other way. And what I was having people object to is like, okay, that could let this dirty plant in Southwest New Mexico continue because I can make it up someplace else. Certainly it's your decision to shut down the dirty plant. But if your goal is really to get your company to X carbon emissions, then
Mm.
the most cost effective way to do it might be to leave that dirty plant and then put super clean plants somewhere else. I'll leave it to environmental scientists to say if that's a valid thing, but portfolio wise, planning wise, that might be their best option.
Yeah, if the forecasts are reasonable, then comparing the alternatives could give you an answer like that. And I was talking to a client yesterday because I'm trying to, get my bearings in the space and form an opinion with some knowledge. And one thing that they pointed out is that when different business units see, lower emission projects being funded and capital allocated toward, the lower funded ones or the lower emission, projects, then that incentivizes the higher emission ones to get better, right? To whether it's, better equipment, better tech on the midstream stuff or whatever it is. I thought that was interesting because I'm glad to hear you say that because that was my hypothesis is that from a planning perspective, It's another thing to forecast. It's another thing to optimize. So the optimization here is around cost and technology and reduction as opposed to maximization of like production. And then the other side of it is it's another metric. And so it's another metric, your carbon intensity sits there next to NPV and maybe rate of return, whatever your other economic or production target metrics of choice are. It's another metric that sits there and you've got to balance those. Some even thinking about getting to quantifying what their carbon price is. So here's the dollar amount of NPV that we'll give up in order to reduce a metric ton of
Right.
on our carbon intensity. That stuff's been interesting because from the outside and just hearing consulting firms, technology companies, a lot of people talk about it. It seems inflated and on the impact of not the eventual impact, but the change that's needed to workflows and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't, but technically what needs to go on, and sometimes we get a whole subject of whether they're talking about just emissions from our operations or emissions from their products, but that's a whole nother can of
Yeah.
worms. But yeah, planning is not a difficult thing to set up. It's
Yeah.
okay. Here's a new constraint, and you got to tell me if there's any benefits that you want to quantify. It doesn't have to be money. Any benefits you want to quantify in some way that's going to drive the models to take things out. In your example, when certain units are seeing that lower emission things are getting the green light, that means that somebody is running some numbers in their head as to what they want to achieve. And wouldn't it be nice if they could just communicate that to everybody so that everybody gets on the same page? We get it.
Yeah. And I think the example is, you have two projects and one is slightly higher NPV, but the other is slightly lower emissions, and the lower emissions one gets picked. Then communicating the reason for that decision and how that was come to, that'll drive the incentives and all that stuff. Maybe a last question, we'll see where we go. On the oil and gas and the planning side, like, as you said you're phasing yourself out, what do you wanna see change in the industry over the next 10 years as you're passing some proverbial baton to somebody? What do you
So
what do you wanna see happen?
what I want to see happen again in the planning world, because I'll stick to what I know. I don't have much hope in the near term for it, but I do think that plans need to be much more sophisticated in terms of the uncertainty and how it's being handled. Doesn't necessarily have to be handled through Monte Carlo or any particular thing, but um, if we could understand the uncertainty or be able at least to communicate and discuss the uncertainty in a more sophisticated way. Uncertainty is interesting because our brains aren't very good at dealing with it. And again, I think we have to make some assumptions and deal with some uncertainties and say, okay, we haven't covered them all. We covered the ones we can think of. And it's the same problem I was alluding to before. There are people in certain positions that are either fascinated by this or believe it's important. They very seldom get much of a hearing as they go up into upper levels, and that could change as people move on and retire. And those people in the upper levels that want to pay attention don't get much of a hearing in the investment community. So at every level, no one wants to learn all the subtleties. But to me, we end up with these plans or people think that they are promises.
Yeah.
It's an inherently uncertain industry when most of your major projects fail by almost not by design, but by definition. And then when you are creating long-term projects on a commodity price, and then when you have an uncertain future as to what your commodity is going to be, the appetite for it in the world, or the healthiness of it for the world, or anything else, is almost overwhelming uncertainty, which can be a problem too. But at least the language of uncertainty, thinking about that would be a extremely useful thing to get higher in the decision process.
Have you seen that actually make progress?
Whatever the negative of progress is, it's gotten worse in the last 10 years, and maybe 20 years, because at one time when, classic example, because there was lots of numbers for it, you'd go out in the Gulf of Mexico, you'd drill a well, and you know what the chances are in the Gulf of Mexico of getting a big, small, medium, and all kinds of other things for it. Then we got into what I call the unconventional, which is not conventional, but in North America, shale gas and things like that. People thought there was no risk in that because you couldn't drill a dry hole. In fact, you just ask yourself to invest several $billions before you know whether it's probable or not. So it's
Yeah.
an enormous risk, but it's a different kind of risk. It's a correlated, not an uncorrelated risk. It comes down to the same reason that the banks failed in the Great Recession. But anyway, people didn't understand that, well, if we all die, we all die together. All these projects are worth nothing, or they they extrapolate on 6 months of production the next 60 years on 6 wells, next 600
Yep.
wells in the next 60 years. No, okay, let's go drill.
Yep.
So but regardless, people stopped even trying to do risk because they're at some level, somebody was convinced that they were now in a risk-free manufacturing and make plastic bags. It really is different than drilling wells, even in an unconventional way.
So you're saying the Toyota factory model that all the big four consultants were selling for millions of dollars was actually bullshit?
At least doesn't consider, I'll be kinder, it doesn't consider the complexities involved.
Okay, that's a nicer way to say it's bullshit. There's some things to learn from it, but yeah, the way that I saw it trying to be implemented was disgusting. Now that you say that, like, the people that have worked offshore, the people that have worked conventional fields and things like that, they have an understanding of they know what piece of S is, right? And a lot of people that have only worked onshore, unconventional, don't. Maybe they've heard of it, they remember it from school, but they haven't actually applied it. And I would think that, and I ask because I haven't really seen like the same people that appreciated risk and uncertainty and thought about it in a what I would say a mature way that I encountered 10 years ago. They're the same ones that
Mhm.
think about it in a mature way now. And I haven't seen too many people make the switch. Some companies have because they hired somebody from a different company that already got it. But yeah, I haven't seen that much progress there.
Now, I think the problem changed enough from the people you're talking about that could do it in a mature way. They were convinced that it was a whole new world. It's not, but it is a world you have to have enough sophistication to realize it's a different way of applying risk. Oftentimes, the application would be the same if you were thinking about, is this unconventional field likely to be profitable as opposed to that unconventional field? But very quickly it gets into you're drilling your 1,000 wells, and then what's the probability of the next well in 1,000 wells? It ends up being just a statistical problem.
Yeah.
You're drilling so many of them that you will drill to the mean. The question always was, what was the mean?
Right.
Where if you had a statistical, if you're in the Gulf of Mexico and you had a bunch of numbers, you kind of knew what the mean was, as you could assume what the mean was. You just want to know where you were around the mean. Now you're saying, okay, I'm going to drill so many wells, I'll hit the mean. That's know what the mean is.
Yeah, but a 1% difference on what the mean is could
Right.
make or
Same
break
result.
a lot of
Yeah,
things. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. So David Fulford says hi
Oh, cool.
also. And then he also wanted me to ask you stories around C-suite misuses and misunderstandings of linear optimization. I think we talked about things around that, but
Yeah. So I'll let the C-suite a little bit off the hook because
okay.
David used to ask me questions after SVE papers that made me uncomfortable. Um, by the time you're communicating with the C-suite, I don't think you say the word linear optimization. Unless they really, really are super into it, you kind of want to say, here's the world that we created. Here's how we can tell you it differs from the real world. Here are some learnings that we got, and here are three different options we're offering you, suggesting to you to go forward. And if Sweet Sweet really understands linear optimization, then they may very well say, yeah, of your three options, I want to take number four, which is change these assumptions and run it out. Tell me what you got. That would be sweet. Now, if we drop a level below them, there's all kinds of abuses of linear optimization by the people that are actually directly managing or doing them. And it goes back to the things we did before, which is
Yeah.
saying that I am not acknowledging the modelness of this model. I have this really cool thing that I hit a button and eventually, and maybe very quickly, an answer comes out. And therefore, it's even better than magic because it's magic that somebody understands. I have David Holford understands it. I understand it enough to talk about it for 15 minutes, then I'm done, So, um, and it's the same magic as a light bulb to me. I kind of basically understand what goes on, but
Yeah.
so it's flip the light. The bottom line is it takes assumptions, it takes variables, it takes a goal, and under the right conditions, it unerringly finds you the mathematically precise answer to a completely imprecise and made up question.
Yeah.
And some people just can't keep that in mind, that just because this is an incredible piece of math, you fed it a bunch of straw. And it's very useful straw. I'm a big
Yeah.
advocate of it, but it has so much gee whiz that some people don't understand what they're really doing.
And that I think is some of the I think people do have a desire, they have a hard time quelling of having the easy button. right? That considers all the constraints, it considers all the things, and just spits out the optimal plan, but it's just not there yet. And I think the workforce will reduce by quite a bit if that technology does come to light. Yeah, that's also a good point for, why you wanna keep the number of digits that show in your portfolio model pretty
Yeah.
low, like round to the nearest 100,000,000 probably or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We used to have a difficult time with the programmer. Every time we got rid of it, it showed somewhere else where we'd get literally not lying 10 numbers to the right of the decimal point. And you're going, we pulled numbers out of the air and it's like, "Well, whatever." It's a machine that very quickly takes your assumptions and makes them into it's not a decision, but an answer, a group of things that are going to happen in time at a certain percentage. Everything else is made up, hopefully intelligently.
Made up intelligently. I like it. The other one he asked about your feelings on Jaguar nowadays.
Uh,
I don't know what that's
Yeah.
about.
Oh, so I used to be, I still am not a Jaguar enthusiast to some extent, but I had one
The animal or the vehicle?
vehicle.
Okay, yeah.
I had one wonderful car in the West, and this we're getting it to get edited out, I'm sure. 10 years or more. And then I got another one. It was not a sports car, but it was the closest thing they could make the regular sedan into a sports car. It had the same engine as a Ford F-250, it had 5 liters. Also, anyway, it's a great car, except that occasionally it wouldn't start. I mean, literally, it's not like it would go, it would just literally not start. And I always worried whenever I went anywhere, I was parking in a downstairs parking garage. So eventually, this before the warranty actually ran out in a dealership because they were always fixing it, but never figuring out what was wrong with it.
Yeah.
I had it towed like 5 times. Anyway, I now do have a very boring little Mercedes sedan.
I got 2 other questions for you that came from other people that I told that I was interviewing you. They're super high level and they're pretty heavy hitters. Rebecca Allison asked, you to sing a little song.
No.
Yeah, okay. That was the answer I expected.
I'll think tonight under the camouflage of people that are paid to sing, and I'll think
Yeah.
that I'm great, but
There you go. And the last one from Raul, why do you hate French wine?
I hate French wine because it's thin and acidic. This was the argument I used to have with Wayne Sam. I generally don't like French wine. I guess like grew up on California wine, and I just never really liked what I was having. And I am told and completely convinced it's true. If I spend enough money, I would change my mind. Question, I told him that's like Disneyland. That's not wine anymore. That's like, how much money do you have to spend? I have never had a French red wine in my price point, which is not high, that I enjoyed more than the same price point for a Italian or a American or a South American wine.
I think that was a good foray into the pretentious topics of somewhat expensive cars and wine. Let's bring it back down. This has been awesome. It's been really good to talk to you, Jim. I don't know. It's been too long. So I kind of want to bring it back around to kind of the idea of enjoying yourself while also striving or, working or attempting to achieve something, like whatever your definition of success is. So what thoughts, advice, anything that we haven't talked about, or even if we have, what would you say to somebody that, they're struggling with finding their own balance between striving for their version of success and being happy along the way?
I kind of already gave my answer, but also reiterated it's that you can't define success and then bolt on balance or also be happy. Some of that your definition of success, in my opinion, has to include the whole package. And I think it also would be very helpful to get them be the same package if you can define your success as something that you have control over to a large extent. None of us have control over like 100%, obviously, but achievement and actualization, not getting to a certain position or something else. If you can say, I want to be highly competent in this very needed field, I think the rest will take care of itself, like we were talking about in another context. But that definition also has to be, I want to truly know my children. I want my wife or significant other, anybody that's important to you, however it works out, to feel like I'm fully present when I'm there and that there's time for these people and there's time for me to be more than just a person going for that one single goal. Being a multifaceted person who people can then say, well, that's actually what I want. I said I wanted this. Like I kind of, I do have a book to recommend, by the way.
Yeah,
Yep.
let it rip.
Called World Enough and Time. It's a
Okay.
line from a poem, World Enough and a Time. It's by an author called, she's name was Christian McGowan. I don't have it here. I don't like it's spelled McGowan, but I think it's MCEWENRON. I think the something is about slowing down and creativity, but it's just 10, 12 different chapters, one for each month, essentially about reviewing what it is that you are looking for in life and how you're getting there and have you bought into busyness for the sake of busyness and what that may be costing you and costing your children. My favorite thing is about children and how children's playtime has just decreased so drastically in the last 25 years. It's just a wonderful book.
We'll find it and get the link and put it in the show notes and description of the video and all that stuff so that people can find it. Like you said, you're phasing yourself out of the work world a little bit. But if people do want to connect with you, read, I know you've got SPE papers coming out your ears. They can do that stuff. But if somebody wants to connect with you, meet, talk, are you open to that, or are you going to become a hermit?
I am. After 3 months of not thinking about work at all, he got me sent there. I was laying in bed this morning saying, well, look at answer those. But no, I'd be more than happy. It's interesting when, regardless of what we said before, now whatever I say is truly zero risk. In other words, I got nothing to lose at all. So I'm 100% willing to tell anybody politely, because I'm a polite person, what my opinion of certain questions are, and they can take it or leave it. And I know I'll very quickly become outdated, but it is interesting that, and that the company that we work for kind of went through many, many changes to the point that it became where I just didn't want to be there anymore. But it's interesting that you feel in those last 5 years or so, or especially the point where just that I really rather not money, where you point that I'm actually at the very height of my powers because I'm not afraid anymore to say what I think. If someone wants to fire me, then that's fine. Or some client wants to run off, then that's fine because they wouldn't have been a good client anyway. So no one ever did respect that. Ever happened with me that wasn't 100% positive. I became a better employee, a better analyst, a better everything when I reached the point that I thought I'd make my life. To the point I think I retired better than I ever was. Now, did I don't want to be there anymore? No, I did not. Do I love waking up and doing what I want to do? I do 100%. I recommend anybody who has the money. But it doesn't mean that I wasn't the work itself, the task of the work itself, I really always enjoyed to the very end because I got to the point that no one was ever going to ask me a question I didn't know the answer to, or to talk about why I didn't know the answer to.
Mm.
Yeah, I didn't know all the answers, obviously, but I got the point that I could say, okay, here's what I don't know and why I don't know it. And I was very confident there wasn't somebody else going to say, BS, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Because they said it by then if it was true.
So is there a place or preferred way for people to reach out to you?
Probably the best thing is to email me. I tend not to answer the phone if I don't recognize the number. That's pretty common these days, I think, because more calls are spam than not.
Only marketers and sociopaths call people anymore.
That worrying.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jim. This has been really good.
Sure. I enjoyed it. Nice to have my ego stoked.
Perfect. You're nothing if not vain.